As soon as the hull gave way in the snow, splitting with a low groan that echoed across the frozen silence like the crack of distant thunder, the crew of the merchant vessel Perseverance pushed on, steady and calm, their breath forming pale clouds in the Arctic air as they gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to leave the ship that had been their home for 8 long months trapped in ice. You stand on the deck, watching the jagged split widen slowly in the starboard side, the timbers groaning under the immense pressure of the frozen sea that has held you captive since autumn. The year is 1824, and you are one of 19 men who ventured north seeking whale oil and fortune, only to find yourselves imprisoned by winter in a landscape that stretches white and silent in every direction. Captain Thomas Hayes stands beside you, his bearded face calm despite the dire circumstances. His voice carries clearly through the cold air as he addresses the assembled crew. "Gentlemen, our ship has served us well, but she can no longer protect us. We will establish camp on the ice and wait for the thaw. Gather your warmest clothing, your tools, and whatever food you can carry. We leave within the hour." The men move with practiced efficiency, their movements deliberate rather than frantic. Months of confinement have taught you all patience. Panic serves no purpose in this frozen world where every action must be measured and purposeful. You descend below deck one final time, the familiar creaking of the ladder a sound you have heard thousands of times. The dim interior smells of tar, salt, and the mustiness of long enclosure. You gather your belongings, a wool blanket, an extra shirt, your mittens lined with sealskin, a tin cup, and a small knife your father gave you before you left port. These simple objects represent survival. Historical records from Arctic expeditions of this era show that men survived or perished based on such small preparations. Every item carried weight both literal and symbolic. William Carter, the ship's carpenter, emerges from the hold carrying an armload of timber planks. His practical mind is already working on shelter. "We'll need to build something quick," he says, his breath fogging. "The temperature will drop once the sun sets, and we can't spend a night without walls." You help him stack the wood on the ice beside the ship. The surface beneath your feet is solid, several feet thick, though you can hear the faint creaking of the ice sheet as it shifts with unseen currents below. The sound is constant here, a reminder that this frozen world is never truly still. James Morrison, the first mate, organizes the supplies being passed down from the ship. Barrels of salted pork, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, a cask of rum carefully rationed since December. A mainstream historical fact surfaces in your mind. Arctic explorers of this period relied heavily on preserved foods, as fresh provisions were nearly impossible to obtain during winter months. Scurvy remained a constant threat, though few understood why at the time. The men work in silence, broken only by the scrape of barrels on ice and the occasional quiet instruction. Robert Shaw, the ship's cook, secures his pots and utensils, ensuring nothing essential is left behind. His weathered hands move with the certainty of long practice. Every cook on these northern voyages knew that the ability to provide hot food often meant the difference between survival and death. Henry Walsh, one of the younger sailors, pauses to look back at the ship. The Perseverance lists slightly now, the damaged hull settling deeper into the snow that has drifted against her sides. "Strange to leave her," he murmurs. You understand his feeling. The ship has been your entire world for months. Within her wooden walls, you found shelter from storms, warmth from the cold, and a sense of order in the chaos of the Arctic. Now she fails you, and you must create a new home on the ice itself. Captain Hayes surveys the assembled supplies and nods with satisfaction. "We have enough to last until summer," he announces. "The ice will break up in June or July. Until then, we survive." His confidence steadies the men. Hayes is not given to false optimism, which makes his assessment all the more reassuring. If he believes survival is possible, the crew believes it too. The work of establishing camp begins immediately. William Carter selects a site about 200 yards from the ship, on a flat section of ice protected by a pressure ridge that rises like a low wall to the north. This will block the worst winds, he explains, already measuring timber with his eye. You and several others begin clearing snow from the chosen spot. The work warms your body quickly despite the cold. Each shovelful reveals the hard, blue-white ice beneath. Some researchers studying Arctic survival note that physical labor was essential not just for practical purposes, but for maintaining morale and body heat during long periods of inactivity. Edward Price, the ship's surgeon, watches the work with a thoughtful expression. His medical knowledge will be crucial in the months ahead. He carries his instruments and medicines in a leather case that never leaves his side. A curious detail from expedition records shows that surgeons often served as naturalists as well, documenting wildlife and weather patterns. As the afternoon light begins to fade, the basic structure of the first shelter takes shape. William and his helpers have constructed a rectangular frame of timber, about 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. Canvas salvaged from the ship's sails is stretched over the frame and weighted down with blocks of snow. It is crude but functional, a barrier against the wind. Inside, the men lay down planks to create a floor raised slightly above the ice. This small elevation makes an enormous difference. The cold radiates up from the frozen surface, and any insulation, however minimal, helps preserve body heat. You remember reading that indigenous Arctic peoples used similar techniques, building their homes with careful attention to every detail that might trap warmth. The second shelter goes up beside the first, then a third. By the time darkness falls, you have 3 rough structures capable of housing 6 men each, with one smaller shelter designated for storing supplies. It is not comfortable, but it is shelter. Captain Hayes assigns sleeping quarters. You find yourself sharing the middle shelter with William Carter, James Morrison, Henry Walsh, and 2 other sailors named Peter Grant and Samuel Brooks. The 6 of you arrange your blankets on the plank floor, leaving a small space in the center for a makeshift stove William is constructing from an iron pot and some metal piping. "We'll burn seal oil when we can get it," William explains, working the pieces together, "and driftwood if we find any. The fire must be small and carefully managed. We cannot afford to waste fuel." The first night on the ice is bitterly cold. You lie wrapped in your blanket, listening to the breathing of the men around you and the constant groan of the ice beneath. The temperature inside the shelter is barely warmer than outside, but the absence of wind makes it bearable. You can see your breath forming clouds in the dim light of a single candle. Sleep comes in fragments. Each time you drift off, a new sound wakes you. The crack of ice, the howl of wind, the cough of another man struggling with the dry, frozen air. You think of the ship so close and yet already abandoned, her familiar corridors now dark and empty. When dawn arrives, it comes gradually, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to pale gray. You emerge from the shelter stiff and aching, but alive. The other men do the same, their faces drawn but determined. Captain Hayes is already up, studying the horizon with a small brass telescope. "We need to establish a routine," he announces when everyone has gathered. "Regular watches to monitor the ice conditions and watch for wildlife. Hunting parties to search for seals or birds. And we must continue improving our shelters. Winter here lasts many more weeks." His words remind you of accounts from other Arctic expeditions. The successful ones were those that maintained discipline and purpose. Men with tasks to occupy their minds and hands fared better than those left idle to dwell on their circumstances. James Morrison organizes the first hunting party. You volunteer along with Henry Walsh and Robert Shaw. James distributes weapons: 2 muskets, carefully protected from moisture, and several harpoons used for whaling. Seals surface at breathing holes in the ice, James explains. We must find these holes and wait. The hunt requires patience you have not yet learned. You trudge across the ice, scanning for the telltale signs James describes: small mounds of snow where seals have scraped breathing holes, or the faint discoloration where water has splashed and frozen. The landscape appears featureless to your untrained eye, an endless plain of white broken only by occasional ridges of jumbled ice. After 2 hours of searching, Henry spots something. There, he says quietly, pointing to a slight depression in the snow about 50 yards ahead. The group approaches slowly, careful not to make noise that might alert a seal below. James positions himself beside the hole with a harpoon ready. The rest of you stand back, waiting in silence. The cold seeps through your boots, up your legs, settling deep in your bones. You stamp your feet gently, trying to maintain circulation without disturbing the hunt. Minutes stretch into an hour. Your face goes numb despite the scarf wrapped around it. Just as you begin to think no seal will appear, the surface of the breathing hole shatters. A dark shape emerges, sleek and glistening. James strikes with practiced speed. The harpoon drives through the seal's body, and the animal thrashes violently, spraying water that freezes instantly in the air. James holds firm to the line as the seal struggles. Robert moves forward with a club, ending the animal's suffering with one quick blow. The silence that follows feels profound. You have taken a life to preserve your own. The seal lies still on the ice, its dark blood spreading in a growing stain. James offers a quiet word of thanks, a habit learned from whalers who respected the creatures that sustained them. "Good," James says simply. "This will feed us for several days." Dragging the seal back to camp proves more difficult than you anticipated. The animal weighs well over 100 pounds, and the ice is uneven. You take turns pulling, your muscles burning with the effort. By the time you reach the camp, the sun has moved noticeably across the pale sky. Robert Shaw, the cook, immediately sets to work butchering the seal. His knife moves with practiced efficiency, separating meat from blubber, setting aside organs that can be eaten or used for bait. Nothing goes to waste. The blubber is especially valuable, providing both fuel for lamps and calories in a diet otherwise lacking in fat. Historical records show that Arctic peoples consumed seal blubber raw to prevent vitamin deficiency, though European explorers often cooked it. That evening, you taste seal meat for the first time. Robert has boiled it in a pot over William's small stove, adding some salt from the ship's stores. The flavor is strong, oily, unlike anything you have eaten before. But it is warm and filling, and your body craves the nourishment. You eat slowly, savoring each bite. Captain Hayes portions the meat carefully, ensuring everyone receives an equal share. "We must hunt again tomorrow," he says. "And every day we can. One seal will not last long among 19 men." The success of the hunt has lifted everyone's spirits. The men eat and talk quietly, their voices carrying a note of hope that was absent this morning. You realize that purpose matters as much as shelter or food. Accomplishing something, however small, reminds each man that he still has agency in this frozen world. After the meal, Edward Price, the surgeon, examines everyone for signs of frostbite or illness. His touch is gentle as he checks your fingers, ears, and nose for the telltale white patches that indicate freezing tissue. "You are well," he pronounces, "but be vigilant. Frostbite can occur in minutes if you are not careful." You have learned to recognize the early warning signs: the prickling sensation as blood flow decreases, the numbness that follows, the way skin turns waxy and pale. Out here, your body is both your most valuable tool and your greatest vulnerability. As the days pass, a routine emerges. Each morning, Captain Hayes assigns tasks: hunting parties, ice observations, shelter improvements, firewood collection from driftwood found along pressure ridges, and cooking duties. The structure provides comfort, a framework within which to organize time that might otherwise blur into meaningless cold and waiting. You learn to read the ice, understanding its moods and movements. Cracks appear and disappear as the ice shifts with tides and currents beneath. Pressure ridges form where ice sheets collide, creating jumbled landscapes of frozen blocks stacked like giants' toys. Some researchers note that sea ice is never static, constantly responding to wind, current, and temperature changes that create a dynamic, dangerous environment. William Carter continues improving the shelters. He insulates walls with packed snow, creating thick barriers that trap warmth inside. Small improvements make noticeable differences. The addition of a snow vestibule at each entrance reduces heat loss. Sealskin curtains over doorways block drafts. The hunting parties become more skilled. James teaches you to recognize seal behavior, to distinguish between breathing holes that are actively used and those that have been abandoned. You learn patience, the ability to stand motionless in terrible cold, waiting for the moment when a dark head breaks the surface. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after leaving the ship, you wake to find the world transformed. Snow has fallen during the night, thick and soft, covering the camp in a blanket of white. The shelters are half buried, only their peaked roofs visible. The air is completely still, and the silence feels absolute. You dig your way out, the snow cascading off the canvas roof. The other men emerge one by one, blinking in the diffuse light. The storm has changed everything. Familiar landmarks are gone, buried under several feet of new snow. The pressure ridge that protects your camp has grown taller, new drifts piled against its base. Captain Hayes surveys the scene with his usual calm. "We dig out and continue," he says. "Check the supply shelter first." The supply shelter has collapsed under the weight of snow. You and several others dig frantically, worried that precious food has been lost or damaged. After an hour of work, you reach the entrance and crawl inside. Relief floods through you when you see that the barrels and crates remain intact, protected by the collapsed canvas. William organizes a rebuilding effort. "We need stronger supports," he says, examining the broken frame. "The snow weighs more than I calculated." You spend the rest of the day reinforcing all the shelters, adding additional timber supports and reshaping the roofs to shed snow more effectively. The physical labor exhausts you, but it also demonstrates something important. You can adapt. When the environment defeats your first attempt, you learn and try again. That evening, as you sit around the small stove sharing seal meat and hardtack, Henry Walsh asks the question everyone has been thinking, but no one has voiced. How long can we last here? Captain Hayes considers the question carefully before answering. "We have food for perhaps 6 weeks if we ration carefully and hunting remains successful. After that, we will need to rely entirely on what we can catch. The ice should begin breaking up in late June or early July. We left the ship in mid-April, so we must endure approximately 10 to 12 more weeks." The calculation hangs in the air. 12 weeks! It seems both impossibly long and potentially survivable. You think of all that can happen in 12 weeks: storms, illness, accidents, starvation. But you also remember that you have already survived several weeks, learning and adapting with each day. James Morrison speaks up, his voice steady. "We have survived worse than this, some of us. The key is to stay busy, stay hopeful, and stay together." His words prove prophetic. The following weeks test the crew in ways that have nothing to do with physical survival. The monotony becomes oppressive. Each day resembles the last. Wake in the frozen shelter, eat a small breakfast of seal meat or salt pork, venture onto the ice to hunt or gather, return to eat a small dinner, sleep in the cold. There are no books, no diversions beyond conversation that gradually exhausts every topic. You find yourself counting things to pass time: the planks in the shelter roof, the stitches in your mittens, the number of breaths between each gust of wind. Some men grow quiet, retreating into themselves. Others talk compulsively, repeating the same stories from their lives before the ice. Edward Price notices the change in mood and speaks to Captain Hayes. "The men need something to occupy their minds," he says. "Idleness is as dangerous as cold." Hayes agrees and introduces new activities. He organizes navigation lessons, teaching the crew to use a sextant and calculate position by the stars. William demonstrates carpentry techniques. You find yourself learning skills you never imagined needing, the kind of practical knowledge that transforms from mere information into wisdom when survival depends on it. The lessons help. Men who were growing listless become engaged again, asking questions, practicing new skills. You discover that learning provides a kind of warmth that no fire can match. One evening, as you practice tying knots under James's instruction, you hear a sound that makes everyone freeze. A low, rumbling roar echoes across the ice, deep and powerful. The men exchange glances, fear flickering in their eyes. "Polar bear," James says quietly. "Everyone inside, weapons ready." You scramble into the shelters, your heart pounding. Through gaps in the canvas, you scan the surrounding ice. At first, you see nothing. Then movement catches your eye. A massive white shape moving along a pressure ridge about 100 yards away. The bear is enormous, far larger than you imagined. It moves with fluid grace despite its size, its head swinging back and forth as it tests the air. You have heard stories of polar bears from whalers, tales of their strength and fearlessness. Some accounts describe bears breaking through ship decks or dragging men from tents. Captain Hayes loads a musket, his movements calm and deliberate. If it approaches, we fire warning shots. Only if it attacks do we aim to kill. The bear pauses, lifting its nose to catch the scent from the camp. For long minutes, it stands motionless. You barely breathe, watching this apex predator consider whether to investigate further. Then, without apparent reason, the bear turns and lumbers away. Its white form gradually disappears into the landscape, blending so perfectly with the snow that you can no longer distinguish bear from ice. The men release their held breaths in a collective sigh. "Post watches from now on," Hayes orders. "Someone awake at all times. Bears are curious and persistent. It may return." The encounter reminds everyone that you are not alone in this frozen world. Other creatures also struggle to survive here, and some of them see humans as either competition or prey. The watch schedule adds another layer of structure to your days, a necessary vigilance that keeps at least one man alert through every hour. You take the watch from midnight to 3 in the morning. The Arctic night in May is not truly dark. The sun dips below the horizon but leaves a twilight glow that never quite fades. You stand wrapped in every piece of clothing you own, stamping your feet to maintain circulation, scanning the ice for movement. The silence during these watches feels different from the silence of day. It presses closer, more intimate. You hear the ice singing, a strange creaking and groaning that sounds almost musical. Some researchers describe this phenomenon as caused by the expansion and contraction of the ice sheet as temperatures fluctuate, creating stresses that release inaudible pops and sighs. During your watch, you see the northern lights for the first time. The aurora begins as a faint green glow on the horizon, then spreads across the sky in shimmering curtains of light. Colors ripple and dance, green, blue, occasionally purple or red. The display is so beautiful it makes you forget the cold for a moment. You wake the other men to see it. They emerge from the shelters, tilting their heads back to watch the sky. For a few minutes, no one speaks. The aurora needs no words. Its silent beauty fills something in each man that has been empty since the ship was crushed. I read that Vikings believed the lights were reflections from the shields of warrior maidens, Edward Price says softly. Others thought they were spirits dancing. Whatever they are, they're magnificent, Henry Walsh breathes. The lights continue their display for over an hour before gradually fading. When they disappear, the men return to the shelters, but something has changed. The aurora reminded everyone that even in this harsh place, beauty exists. Survival is not the only thing the Arctic offers. The next day brings new challenges. The temperature drops sharply, falling to what Edward estimates as 30 degrees below zero. At this temperature, exposed skin freezes in seconds. Breathing becomes painful, the air so cold it burns your lungs. Captain Hayes cancels all non-essential activities. The men stay inside the shelters, huddled together for warmth. You sleep more than usual, conserving energy and heat. The small stove provides minimal warmth, just enough to prevent the interior from becoming a death trap. You drift in and out of sleep, your mind wandering through memories. You think of home, of the family you left behind, of warm summer days that feel like fantasy now. Around you, other men mumble in their sleep, calling out names or fragments of dreams. When the temperature finally moderates 2 days later, emerging from the shelter feels like stepping into warmth, though the thermometer still reads well below freezing. The contrast reminds you how quickly your perception adjusts, how cold and warm become relative terms when survival depends on small differences. The hunting that day proves difficult. The extreme cold has driven seals deep, seeking warmer water below the ice. You return empty-handed after 6 hours of searching. That night, rations are reduced slightly. No one complains, but you can see worry in the faces around the stove. We must diversify, James says. Look for Arctic birds, fish through the ice, anything we can catch or trap. William Carter fashions ice fishing equipment from supplies salvaged from the ship. He shows you how to drill through the ice using a hand auger, creating a hole several inches wide that reaches the water below. The ice is over 3 feet thick, and drilling through it leaves your arms aching. You lower a line baited with seal blubber and wait. Ice fishing requires even more patience than seal hunting. You sit beside the small hole, watching the line, feeling the cold creep up from the ice into your body. After an hour, you feel a tug. Pulling up the line reveals a small fish, silver and writhing. It is not large, but it is food. That evening, Robert prepares fish soup, boiling the small catch with some dried peas and salt. The portion is small, but the taste of something different from seal meat lifts everyone's mood. You begin to understand how variety matters almost as much as quantity when you are eating the same things day after day. The calendar, marked carefully by Captain Hayes on a piece of driftwood, shows that a month has passed since leaving the ship. You have survived April and entered May. The days grow noticeably longer. The sun barely sets now, just grazing the horizon before climbing again. The extended daylight has both advantages and disadvantages. You can work longer, hunt more effectively, and navigate without darkness limiting your movements. But sleep becomes difficult when the sun shines through the thin canvas walls at all hours. Some men tie cloth over their eyes, trying to create artificial darkness. Edward Price observes that several men show signs of fatigue that goes beyond normal tiredness. The constant light disrupts our natural rhythms, he explains. Our bodies expect darkness for sleep. Without it, we never truly rest. You notice this in yourself, a constant low-grade exhaustion that sleep doesn't quite cure. Your thoughts move more slowly. Simple tasks require more effort. It is like moving through water, everything dragged down by invisible weight. Captain Hayes recognizes the problem and institutes night hours, when all unnecessary activity stops and men must remain in their shelters even if they cannot sleep. The enforced rest helps somewhat, though the bright light continues to seep through every gap in the canvas. One morning during these night hours, you lie awake listening to the breathing of the men around you. Peter Grant snores softly. Samuel Brooks mutters in his sleep. William Carter is so still, you check to make sure his chest rises and falls. These men have become closer than family, bound by shared hardship into something deeper than friendship. A shout from outside breaks the stillness. You scramble from your blanket and emerge to find James pointing toward the north. There, moving slowly across the ice, is a line of caribou. 8 or 9 animals, their antlers silhouetted against the bright sky. "Fresh meat," James breathes, "more than we can eat in a week." The hunting party assembles quickly, James, Robert, Henry, and yourself, armed with the muskets and moving with as much stealth as possible across the ice. The caribou are perhaps 300 yards away, grazing on lichens exposed where wind has scoured the snow from rocks. You have never hunted caribou before. James positions the 4 of you in a loose line, then explains in whispers, "Wait until they are within 100 yards. We each choose a target. Fire together on my signal." The approach seems to take hours. You move during moments when the caribou have their heads down feeding, freezing when any animal raises its head to scan for danger. Your heart pounds so hard you fear the animals will hear it. When James gives the signal, 4 shots crack across the ice simultaneously. 2 caribou drop immediately. A third stumbles but runs. The rest of the herd scatters, their hooves thundering as they race away. You and Henry pursue the wounded animal. It leaves a trail of blood drops on the snow, dark red against white. After a quarter mile, you find it collapsed, its breathing labored. Henry ends its suffering with a final shot. Returning to camp with 3 caribou is a triumph. The entire crew helps drag them back, everyone energized by the success. Robert immediately begins butchering, his practiced hands separating meat, hide, and organs. That evening, you feast. Fresh caribou meat roasted over a larger fire than usual, the fat dripping and sizzling. For the first time in weeks, everyone eats until full. The mood in camp transforms into something almost festive. Captain Hayes allows an extra ration of rum, carefully portioned. You sip the burning liquid, feeling it warm your throat and belly. Around you, men laugh and tell stories, their faces bright in the firelight. For a few hours, you forget where you are. But reality returns with the night. Despite the feast, you are still stranded on the ice with dwindling supplies and no guarantee of rescue. The caribou meat will last perhaps 2 weeks if carefully rationed. Then you will be hunting seals again, hoping each day brings success. The days continue to blur together. Hunt, eat, sleep, maintain the shelters, stand watch. You develop a kind of meditation in the repetition, finding peace in the simple rhythm of survival. Your mind grows quieter, less concerned with the past or future, focused entirely on the present moment. You notice changes in yourself that go beyond the physical. Your senses sharpen. You can smell seal on the wind from hundreds of yards away. You see details in the ice that would have been invisible when you first arrived. The subtle variations in color that indicate thickness, the patterns that show where pressure ridges will form. Edward Price remarks on these changes one evening. "We are becoming creatures of this place," he says, "adapting to it in ways I never imagined possible." You understand what he means. The Arctic has carved away everything unnecessary, leaving only what serves survival. You move differently, think differently, even breathe differently than you did when you walked the streets of port cities far to the south. One morning, you notice water pooling on the surface of the ice near camp. The temperature has risen above freezing for the first time in months. The thaw is beginning. The news spreads quickly through camp. Men emerge from shelters to see the puddles, their faces showing cautious hope. Captain Hayes dampens the enthusiasm with characteristic realism. "The thaw will take weeks," he cautions. "The ice must break up enough for a ship to pass through. We are not rescued yet." But the psychological impact of seeing liquid water cannot be understated. It represents change, progress, the approaching end of this ordeal. You kneel beside a puddle and dip your fingers in, marveling at how water can exist in liquid form again. The warming brings new challenges. The surface of the ice becomes treacherous, a slush that soaks through boots and makes walking exhausting. Seals become harder to hunt as breathing holes collapse into larger openings. The shelters begin to leak as snow melts and drips through the canvas. William Carter works constantly to waterproof the structures, but it becomes a losing battle. You wake one morning to find water dripping on your face, a steady, cold splash that soaks your blanket. Everyone is damp now, their clothing never quite drying in the humid air. Edward Price watches for signs of illness. Wet and cold create perfect conditions for respiratory infections that could kill as surely as starvation. He doses men with what medicines remain, trying to prevent sickness before it starts. Despite the discomfort, morale remains surprisingly high. The thaw means survival. Every pool of meltwater, every crack in the ice, every degree the temperature rises brings you closer to the moment when ships can navigate these waters again. You stand watch one midnight in early June and see the first lead, a channel of open water splitting the ice sheet. It is narrow, barely 10 feet wide, but it is water. You call Captain Hayes, who studies it through his telescope. "It will widen," he says. "In a week or two, there may be enough open water for a ship to reach us." The waiting becomes almost unbearable now that rescue seems close. You scan the horizon constantly, looking for masts or smoke from a steamer. But the sea remains empty, just ice and water and the occasional seabird. Then, on a morning that starts like any other, Henry Walsh shouts from his watchpost, "Sail! I see a sail!" Everyone rushes out of the shelters. There, barely visible on the northern horizon, is the unmistakable silhouette of a ship. Your heart leaps. After nearly 2 months on the ice, rescue has arrived. Captain Hayes fires the musket 3 times, the signal for distress. You watch anxiously as the ship changes course, turning toward your position. It takes hours for the vessel to navigate through the broken ice, but eventually it draws near enough to read the name on its bow: Aurora, a whaling ship out of Aberdeen. The captain of the Aurora, a weathered Scotsman named MacLeod, brings his ship as close as he dares to the ice edge. Boats are lowered, and his crew rows across the remaining distance to your camp. "Thought we'd find corpses," MacLeod says bluntly when he steps onto the ice. The Perseverance was reported crushed months ago. The ship was lost, Captain Hayes replies calmly. The crew was not. The rescue takes several hours. All supplies that can be salvaged are loaded into the boats. You take one last look at the shelters that kept you alive, the small stove that provided warmth, the patch of ice that became home. Then you climb into a boat and let the whalers row you toward the Aurora. As the ship's deck rises beneath your feet, you feel the solidity of wood planking, smell the familiar tar and salt of a working vessel. The crew of the Perseverance gathers on deck, 19 men who left their ship in April and survived against odds that would have killed most groups. Captain McLeod provides hot coffee and fresh bread. You eat slowly, your stomach unaccustomed to such rich food after months of seal meat and hardtack. Around you, the crew of the Perseverance sits quietly, too overwhelmed to speak. The voyage south takes 3 weeks. You stand at the rail often, watching the ice recede behind the ship. The Arctic maintains its hold on your imagination even as you leave it behind. You wonder if you will ever see it again, and part of you hopes you will, despite everything you endured. Edward Price spends the voyage documenting the experience, writing detailed notes about survival techniques, nutrition, psychological challenges. Others will come north, he explains. They should learn from our experience. When the Aurora finally reaches port, crowds gather to see the survivors of the Perseverance. Newspapers print sensational accounts of your ordeal. But you find yourself unable to explain what really happened out there on the ice. The truth is too quiet, too internal, to translate into dramatic newspaper prose. The crew disperses slowly. Some men return to sea immediately. Others vow never to leave land again. You find yourself somewhere between, drawn to the ocean but wary of the ice. Years later, you read Edward Price's published account of the expedition. He describes it not as a story of heroism or adventure, but as a study in patient endurance. We survived, he writes, not through dramatic action, but through steady, calm persistence. Each day we did what needed to be done, and eventually enough days passed that we lived. You think often of Captain Hayes's words on that first day. We push on, steady and calm. Those words became the rhythm of your survival, a mantra repeated through hardship and fear. When you tell the story now, you begin with those words, because they contain everything essential about what happened on the ice. The hull gave way, and you pushed on. The shelters collapsed, and you rebuilt them. Food ran short, and you hunted. The cold bit deep, and you endured. There was no single moment of victory, no dramatic rescue from the brink of death. There was only the accumulation of small survivals that added up to life. On quiet evenings, you sometimes close your eyes and hear the ice singing. Feel the cold wrapping around you like a familiar coat. The Arctic changed you in ways both visible and invisible. It taught you that survival is often less about strength than about patience, less about fighting than about adapting. The crew of the Perseverance never sailed together again, but you remained connected by the shared experience of those months on the ice. When you meet Samuel Brooks on a street corner 5 years later, you recognize each other instantly. No words are needed. You simply clasp hands, and in that grip is the understanding that only those who survived it can share. You think about writing your own account, but the words never come. How do you describe the way fear becomes routine? The way hunger feels after the first week? The strange beauty of aurora light on snow? The silence that presses so close it feels like a presence? Instead, you carry the experience quietly, letting it shape your life in subtle ways. You notice when others waste food, when they complain about minor discomforts, when they speak carelessly about endurance. You say nothing, but you remember the ice. The 20th anniversary of the Perseverance's loss brings a small reunion. 8 members of the original crew gather in a tavern, older now, marked by time and other voyages. Captain Hayes raises a glass, his hand steady as it was on the ice. "To those who pushed on," he says simply. "Steady and calm," you all reply in unison, the old rhythm returning as naturally as breathing. The conversation that follows is quiet, reflective. You speak of small things: William Carter's ingenious stove design, Robert Shaw's ability to make seal meat almost palatable, the morning the caribou appeared. No one mentions the fear, the cold, the nights when death felt close. These things are understood without speaking. Henry Walsh, now a ship's officer himself, asks the question that everyone has wondered: would you go back? The table falls silent. You consider your answer carefully. The ice nearly killed you. It took months of your life, left scars both physical and mental. And yet, yes, you say finally, not to be trapped again, but to see it once more, to understand if it was as beautiful as I remember. The others nod. They understand. The Arctic gets into your blood. It becomes part of your story. The hardest chapter, but perhaps the most important. You were tested and survived. That knowledge changes how you see everything else. As the reunion ends and you walk out into the mild evening, you pause to look at the stars. They are the same stars that shone over the ice, but you see them differently now. They are markers of latitude, navigational aids, silent witnesses to human struggle and survival. You continue your life, working various ships, eventually settling into a position training young sailors in ice navigation. When you teach, you speak from experience rather than theory. You describe how ice moves, how to recognize dangerous conditions, how to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. The ice is not evil, you tell your students. It simply is. It will crush your ship if given the opportunity, not from malice, but from mechanical force. Your survival depends on respecting this reality. The lessons extend beyond ice navigation. You find yourself teaching philosophy as much as practical skill. How to maintain calm in crisis. How to make decisions when every option looks bad. How to lead men who are frightened and exhausted. How to find purpose in routine. One student asks, "Were you afraid?" "Every day," you answer honestly. But fear and action are not opposites. You can be afraid and still do what needs to be done. That is not courage. That is survival. Years pass. You grow old, your body marked by decades of hard work and harsh conditions. But your mind remains sharp, still attuned to the lessons learned on the ice. You can still smell when weather will change, still read the subtle signs that others miss. On your last voyage, serving as ice pilot on a supply ship heading north, you see the ice again. It spreads across the horizon exactly as you remember: white, vast, indifferent. The ship's captain asks if you want to go closer. "No," you say after a long moment. "I paid my respects years ago." But that night, lying in your bunk, you dream of the ice. In the dream, you stand on the frozen surface again, young and strong, surrounded by the crew of the Perseverance. Captain Hayes is giving orders. William Carter is adjusting a shelter. James Morrison is preparing for a hunt. The hull gave way in the snow, and you pushed on, steady and calm. The words repeat like a heartbeat, like the rhythm of the ice itself. You wake with tears on your cheeks, though you cannot say if they are from sorrow or joy, or simply the weight of remembering. You live to see the turn of the century, watching the world change in ways you never imagined. Ships become stronger, better equipped for Arctic conditions. Radio allows communication across vast distances. Survival techniques improve based on accounts like Edward Price's. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. When the ice closes in and the ship fails, survival depends on the same qualities it always has: patience, adaptability, calm persistence, the ability to push on when every rational thought says to give up. In your final days, surrounded by family who never quite understand what the ice meant to you, you find peace in the memories. Not the hardship, though that was real. Not the fear, though that too was constant. But the moments between, the aurora dancing overhead, the taste of fresh caribou after weeks of deprivation, the quiet companionship of men who became brothers through shared ordeal. You tell your grandchildren the story one last time, simplified for young ears, but true in its essentials. The ship broke, you say, so we built a home on the ice and waited for spring. It was cold and hard, but we survived because we worked together and never gave up. They ask if you were scared. You smile and give the same answer you gave your students decades ago. Every day, but we pushed on anyway. That night, you close your eyes for the last time and hear, faintly, the singing of the ice, the low groaning of the frozen sea, the crack of pressure ridges forming, the whisper of wind across endless white plains, the sounds that haunted your nightmares and graced your dreams for 60 years. As soon as the hull gave way in the snow, the crew pushed on, steady and calm. The words carry you gently into darkness, a final reminder of the moment that defined your life. Not the crisis itself, but the response to it. Not the breaking, but the endurance that followed. The ice claimed the Perseverance, but not her crew. 19 men walked away from a crushed ship in one of Earth's harshest environments and lived to tell the tale. The story becomes legend in maritime circles, studied by historians and survival experts, referenced in training manuals and safety protocols. But the true story lives in quieter spaces, in the dreams of old sailors, in the lessons passed from generation to generation, in the understanding that survival is often less dramatic than we imagine. It is not one heroic moment, but countless small decisions to continue, to adapt, to push on. The Arctic ice continues its eternal cycle, freezing and thawing, crushing and releasing. Ships still venture north, seeking resources or adventure or scientific knowledge. Some succeed, some fail. The ice makes no distinctions. It simply is. And somewhere in the frozen north, if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you might hear echoes of the Perseverance crew, the sound of men working together in silence, the scrape of a shovel on ice, the quiet conversation around a small stove, the rhythm of survival continuing one calm, steady day at a time. The hull gave way, the crew pushed on. And in that simple sequence lies a truth that transcends the specific circumstances of 1824 or the Arctic or sailing ships. It speaks to the human capacity to endure, to adapt, to find strength in community and purpose in routine. When you are gone, your children donate your journals to a maritime museum. The curator reads them with growing fascination, not for the dramatic moments, there are few, but for the detailed observations about daily life on the ice. Here is the real story: what men ate, how they stayed warm, the small innovations that made survival possible. The museum creates an exhibition about the Perseverance. Visitors walk through a recreation of the ice camp, complete with rough shelters and a small stove. They read excerpts from various crew members' accounts, each telling the same story from different perspectives. But what impacts visitors most is the final display. A simple piece of canvas from one of the shelters, worn and stained, mounted on a wall with a single quote beneath it. As soon as the hull gave way in the snow, the crew pushed on, steady and calm. People stand before it, reading the words, trying to imagine what such calmness cost. What reserves of strength were required to respond to catastrophe not with panic but with methodical preparation? What leadership kept 19 men focused on survival rather than despair? The exhibition runs for years, becoming one of the museum's most popular installations. Teachers bring students to learn about resilience. Business leaders study it for lessons in crisis management. Families visit and discuss what they would do in similar circumstances. But perhaps the truest tribute comes from those who still go to sea. Sailors who know the weight of storm and ice, who have felt ships shudder beneath them, who understand that the ocean grants no mercy. They stand before the exhibit in silence, hands clasped behind their backs, reading the accounts of men who faced the worst and survived. Sometimes, late at night when the museum is closed, security guards report strange sounds from the Arctic exhibition. The creak of ice, the whisper of wind, voices speaking too quietly to distinguish words. They dismiss it as old buildings settling, or imagination running wild. But perhaps it is something else. Perhaps the ice remembers the men who survived it. Perhaps their story lives on in more than words and artifacts. Perhaps courage, once proven, echoes through time like aurora light through frozen air. The world changes. Ships become icebreakers. Equipment improves. Communication technology makes isolation almost impossible. But the fundamental challenge of survival in extreme conditions remains. And when modern explorers train for Arctic expeditions, they still study the story of the Perseverance. Not for the technology, which is long obsolete, not for the navigation techniques, which have been superseded, but for the mindset. Steady and calm. Push on. Do what needs doing. Adapt and endure. These lessons transcend era and equipment. They speak to something essential about human nature, the capacity to face overwhelming odds with quiet determination, the ability to find order in chaos, purpose in hardship, community in isolation. The Ice Age ended millennia ago, but ice remains. The specific circumstances of 1824 cannot be repeated exactly, but similar challenges arise whenever humans venture into hostile environments. The ocean, the desert, the mountain, space itself, all demand the same qualities that kept the Perseverance crew alive. And so the story continues, retold and reinterpreted, finding new audiences in each generation. Children read simplified versions in school. Historians debate details in academic journals. Psychologists analyze the group dynamics that prevented panic. Survival experts extract practical lessons about shelter, nutrition, and morale. But beneath all the analysis and interpretation, the story remains simple. The hull gave way. The crew pushed on. 19 men survived 2 months on Arctic ice through steady, calm persistence. No miracles, no dramatic rescues. Just daily survival adding up to life. Your great-great-grandchildren visit the museum, standing before the same canvas shelter wall, reading the same quote. They carry your blood, but know little of your life beyond family stories, simplified and worn smooth like beach stones. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, pauses longer than the others. She reads the entire exhibition carefully, studying the details of daily routine, the hunting techniques, the shelter construction. Something in the story speaks to her. Later, she writes a paper for university analyzing the Perseverance survival through the lens of modern psychology. She identifies the factors that kept the crew functional: clear leadership, shared purpose, routine structure, meaningful work, social bonds. Her conclusion echoes what you learned on the ice. Survival in extreme conditions depends less on physical resources than on psychological resilience. The crew endured not because they had everything they needed, but because they worked with what they had and refused to surrender to despair. Your great-great-grandchildren visit the museum, standing before the same canvas shelter wall, reading the same quote. They carry your blood, but know little of your life beyond family stories, simplified and worn smooth like beach stones. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, pauses longer than the others. She reads the entire exhibition carefully, studying the details of daily routine, the hunting techniques, the shelter construction. Something in the story speaks to her. Later, she writes a paper for university analyzing the Perseverance survival through the lens of modern psychology. She identifies the factors that kept the crew functional: clear leadership, shared purpose, routine structure, meaningful work, social bonds. Her conclusion echoes what you learned on the ice. Survival in extreme conditions depends less on physical resources than on psychological resilience. The crew endured not because they had everything they needed, but because they worked with what they had and refused to surrender to despair. She graduates and becomes a psychologist specializing in extreme environment adaptation. Her research helps train astronauts, submarine crews, and Arctic researchers, anyone who must function under prolonged stress in isolated conditions. The lessons learned by the Perseverance crew find new application centuries later. One day, she stands before a group of Mars mission candidates, teaching them how to maintain mental health during the 3-year journey. She begins with a story. In 1824, a ship was crushed by ice in the Arctic. The crew survived on the frozen sea for 2 months. They succeeded not through heroism or luck, but through something more subtle and more powerful: the discipline to stay calm, to work together, and to push on one day at a time. The candidates listen, seeing parallels to their own situation. Like the Perseverance crew, they will be isolated, dependent on each other, facing conditions that can kill without warning. Physical preparation matters, but psychological resilience matters more. Sarah continues, "The captain's words became their mantra. We push on, steady and calm. Not we fight or we conquer. Push on. Keep moving. Stay steady. Remain calm." These 4 principles guided them through their darkest days. As she speaks, you would recognize the truth in her words. The ice did not need conquering. It needed respecting, understanding, enduring. The crew did not overcome the Arctic through force. They survived it through adaptation. The story ripples forward through time, changing form but retaining essence. A teacher in rural Alaska uses it to help students understand their heritage. A therapist employs it as a metaphor for enduring depression. A coach quotes it to motivate athletes through grueling training. The hull gave way in the snow. The crew pushed on, steady and calm. The words take on lives of their own, becoming shorthand for a particular kind of resilience. Not flashy or dramatic, but quiet and persistent. The ability to face catastrophe and respond with methodical preparation rather than panic. In the end, perhaps this is the greatest legacy. Not the survival itself, remarkable as it was, but the model it provides for facing any overwhelming challenge. When the foundations of your life give way, when comfortable certainty collapses, when you find yourself in hostile territory without clear paths forward, then the lessons from the ice remain relevant. You push on, not because success is guaranteed, but because the alternative is surrender. You stay steady, not because you feel confident, but because panic serves no purpose. You remain calm, not because you are unafraid, but because fear and action can coexist. You do what needs doing, one task at a time, until enough time passes that you survive. The Arctic night eventually ends. The ice eventually breaks. The ship eventually appears on the horizon. But you cannot control these things. You can only control your response to their absence. And in that response, in the steady, calm persistence through hardship, lies the path to survival. The hull gave way in the snow, and the crew pushed on, steady and calm. The sentence that begins with crisis ends with method. Between these two poles, the breaking and the pushing, lies the entire story of survival. And it is a story that never truly ends, because as long as humans face challenges greater than themselves, as long as ships venture into dangerous waters, as long as crews must trust each other through hardship, the lessons learned on that frozen sea in 1824 remain vital and alive. If you found this story of quiet endurance and steady survival meaningful, please subscribe to our channel for more contemplative journeys through history's moments of resilience. These are stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, not through dramatic heroism, but through patience, adaptation, and the simple determination to push on. Hit subscribe and join us for more tales of survival told in the calm, measured tones they deserve. Thank you for listening, and may you find your own steady calm when the ice closes in.